When we talk about mental health, we often think about, the big things, right? Work stress, relationships, yeah, the usual suspects, big life changes. Exactly. But have you ever paused and thought about something really basic, like the water you drink every day? I mean, mental health issues are a huge cause of disability worldwide. We know that. And the pandemic, well, it definitely pushed anxiety and depression rates up massively. Yeah. So it just got me wondering, could our tap water actually be like a bigger piece of that puzzle than we think? That's a really fascinating question. It gets right to that deep link between, our environment and our actual biology. Right. And for this deep dive, we're really focusing on this pretty compelling new study that dug into exactly that idea. Okay. The potential connection between elements, metals and things in our drinking water and how we feel mentally, specifically looking at depression and anxiety. Perfect. So the research we're diving into, it's from BMC Medicine, and it's what they call a prospective cohort study. All right, so following people over time. Yeah, basically they followed a huge group, over 24,000 people in China, starting back in 2016 up to 2021. These were healthy folks initially. And what's really interesting here is they didn't just rely on questionnaires about water. They actually measured the metals and non-metals in people's tap water. Oh, wow. Okay, so objective data. Right. And then they tracked who developed depression or anxiety over those years. Plus, and this is important, they also looked at diet. That's crucial because diet could potentially amplify or maybe even buffer some of these effects from the water, right? Exactly. So our mission today really is to break down what this study found. Which specific elements seem linked to depression or anxiety risk, higher or lower risk maybe? And how does diet fit in? Does it change the picture? That's the plan. We want to pull out those key insights for you, make it clear, digestible, without getting lost in all the scientific jargon. Okay, let's do it. So starting broad, what were the main headline findings from this big study? Well, the biggest takeaway is that, yes, they did find significant links between long-term exposure to certain elements in the water and the chances of developing depression or anxiety later on. Okay, so there is a connection. There seems to be, yeah. And also that diet appears to play this moderating role, especially when it comes to anxiety. A moderating role, meaning that what you eat might change how strongly those elements in the water affect your anxiety risk. It suggests we might have some control through food choices. Okay, that's really interesting. Let's break that down. Starting with depression, what specific links did they find there? Right, depression. Well, one of the maybe more surprising findings was about manganese. Higher levels of manganese in the drinking water were actually linked to a lower chance of developing depression. Lower. Really? Yeah, about an 8% lower incidence for what they call a standard deviation increase in manganese. That's just a statistical measure of how much the levels varied. So more manganese, potentially a bit protective against depression. That's not what I would have guessed. Me neither. And the study sort of theorizes why. Manganese is part of this important enzyme, MNSOD. Okay. It basically helps fight oxidative stress inside our cells. And oxidative stress is increasingly thought to play a role in depression. So maybe enough manganese helps our bodies handle that stress better. Okay, that makes biological sense potentially. Now, what about elements that seem to go the other way, increasing depression risk? Okay, found two key ones there, copper and cadmium. Higher levels of both copper and cadmium in the water were associated with a higher incidence of depression. How much higher? About a 6% increase for copper and an 8% increase for cadmium. Again, per that standard deviation measure. Okay, so manganese potentially good, copper and cadmium potentially bad for depression risk at least. Any ideas why for copper and cadmium? Yeah, the paper touches on some possibilities. For copper, they mention it might speed up the breakdown of serotonin. The feel-good neurotransmitter. Exactly. So more copper, maybe less serotonin flowing around. And for cadmium, well, it's been linked to messing with our stress response system, the HPA axis, right? And even potential damage to the blood-brain barrier or direct harm to brain cells. Wow, okay. Those sound pretty significant. Did they look at other elements for depression that didn't show a strong link? They did. They reported no significant association between depression and exposure to zinc, iron, aluminum, selenium, or fluorine in the water. Okay, got it. So that's the depression picture. Now let's switch gears to anxiety. You mentioned things get interesting here. Yeah, this is where it gets a bit complex, especially comparing it to depression. For anxiety, they found higher levels of manganese, iron, and selenium were linked to a higher incidence of anxiety. Wait, manganese too? But that was linked to lower depression. Exactly, it's a really stark contrast. The numbers were pretty big too. A 39% increase in anxiety risk for manganese, 43% for iron, and 14% for selenium per standard deviation increase. 39% for manganese. Wow. How do the researchers even begin to explain manganese seemingly protecting against depression but increasing anxiety risk? Well, they suggest it's likely down to different biological pathways being involved. Manganese can affect various neurotransmitter systems differently, like norepinephrine and dopamine, which are involved in both mood and anxiety. Right. So it's plausible that manganese influences these systems in a way that helps with depression symptoms, but somehow makes anxiety more likely. It's complex brain chemistry. Definitely a fascinating wrinkle. What about the other elements in anxiety? Any links there? Similar to depression, they didn't find significant links between anxiety and zinc, copper, aluminum, cadmium, or fluorine exposure from water. Okay. So manganese, iron, selenium potentially linked to higher anxiety risk. Now, you mentioned diet played a role, especially with anxiety. Yes, this is a really key finding. The study found that diet did seem to modify or change the relationship between some of these elements and anxiety risk. How so? Can you give examples? Sure. They saw that the links between manganese, iron, and anxiety were stronger in people who ate fewer fruits. Okay. And also ate more marine products, seafood, fish, and more meat, both red and white. So low fruit plus high seafood and meat seem to amplify the anxiety link with manganese and iron from water. That seems to be the pattern they observed, yeah. And did they see similar dietary effects with other elements linked to anxiety, like selenium or maybe copper and fluorine, even though they weren't significant overall? They did note something similar for other elements too. For instance, long-term exposure to copper, selenium, and fluorine was linked to a higher risk of anxiety, specifically in those people who ate fewer green leafy vegetables and fewer fruits. So it really seems like fruits and veggies might be protective somehow. That's the strong suggestion. The researchers think fruits and vegetables have compounds that fight oxidative stress and inflammation and maybe help neurotransmitters work better, all good for mental health. Whereas high red meat intake might be pro-inflammatory, potentially bad for anxiety, and maybe eating lots of marine products just increases your overall load of certain elements, compounding the effect from water. That makes a lot of sense. The study also looked at specific groups, right? Were some people more susceptible? Yes, they did what's called subgroup analysis. For depression, they found that the link between cadmium exposure and depression was stronger in older adults, and also in people with lower incomes and those with less education. That's worrying. Any thoughts on why those groups? The paper suggests a few reasons. Maybe lower socioeconomic status means less access to cleaner water sources, so higher exposure. Plausible? Plus, these groups might face more general life stress and have less social support, which are already known risk factors for depression. So it could be a combination of factors. Right, multiple hits, potentially. What about vulnerable groups for anxiety? Was it the same pattern? Interestingly, no. The pattern was a bit different for anxiety. Higher manganese and selenium exposure seem to have stronger links to anxiety in younger people and those with more education. Younger and more educated for manganese and selenium. Okay, that's unexpected. It is. But then for iron, the stronger link with anxiety was seen in older and less educated participants, similar to the cadmium depression link. Complex. And another, finding the links between manganese, iron, selenium, and anxiety were weaker in people who never smoked or drank alcohol. So lifestyle choices like smoking and drinking might interact with this too. It seems possible. The researchers speculate that socioeconomic factors influence element intake through both water and diet, maybe differently for different elements, and things like smoking and drinking, which are themselves linked to anxiety, might just make the effects of these elements worse. Okay. Now, we should definitely mention this is just one study, right? Even a big, well-designed one. Did the researchers point out any limitations themselves? Oh, absolutely. Good science always acknowledges limitations. They noted they measured tap water, not exactly how much each person drank or absorbed. Right, individual intake could vary. Exactly. And they had to assume people didn't move house during the study, which isn't always true. Okay. And ideally, they'd have measured element levels in people's blood. Not just the water, but they didn't have that data. It gives a more direct measure of exposure. Gotcha. So it's a really valuable study pointing towards some important connections, but definitely needs more research to confirm and explore further. Precisely. It lays a great foundation, but it's not the final word. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up for you, our listener. What are the main things to really take away